It starts like any other Saturday morning stroll through a bustling farmer's market. The aroma of fresh produce, the murmur of conversations, the vibrant colors of local crafts. Judge Althea Hayes, dressed in casual weekend attire, blends in with the crowd, enjoying a rare moment of anonymity away from the solemnity of her federal courtroom, until it isn't anonymous anymore. A minor vendor dispute nearby escalates, drawing the attention of Officer Dalton, a cop known for his quick temper and heavy-handed approach, especially in diverse crowds. When Judge Hayes, witnessing a clear overreach, calmly tries to intercede, to remind the officer of procedural fairness, Dalton sees only a black woman interfering, challenging his authority. He dismisses her, then shoves her hard, sending her sprawling to the ground amidst scattered vegetables, her dignity assaulted in public. Dalton feels a surge of power, believing he's just put another disrespectful citizen in her place. But what Officer Dalton, blinded by his racial bias and inflated ego, doesn't know, cannot possibly comprehend, is that the woman he just assaulted, the woman picking herself up from the dirty pavement, isn't just any citizen. She is the Honorable Althea Hayes, a sitting United States federal judge, a jurist whose rulings impact the very laws Dalton is sworn to uphold, and who knows precisely how to wield the power of the bench and the legal system against abuses of power. A storm of judicial fury, internal affairs investigations, and career-ending consequences is about to descend upon Officer Dalton. Stick around. The moment this cop realizes he just laid hands on a federal judge is a masterclass in instant regret. And, hey, as this story unfolds, tell us where you're watching from today, city, state, or country. We love seeing our community gather for these vital narratives. Drop it in the comments below, ready to find out exactly how it all went down. Buckle up, let's dive right in. The sun, already climbing high in the late morning sky, cast a warm, inviting glow over the vibrant chaos of the city center farmers market. Judge Althea Hayes, for once not the Honorable Judge Hayes, but simply Althea, a resident enjoying a rare Saturday off, breathed in the rich aromas of freshly baked bread, ripe peaches, and aromatic herbs. Dressed in comfortable linen pants, a simple cotton blouse and sensible walking shoes, a wide-brimmed straw hat shielding her face, she blended easily into the diverse, bustling crowd. She loved these moments of anonymity, a chance to shed the heavy mantle of her federal robes and immerse herself in the simple pleasures of her community, selecting organic vegetables, chatting with local artisans, feeling the vibrant pulse of the city she served. Her security detail, a discreet and rarely needed perk of her position, had been waved off for the morning. This was her personal time, a brief respite. She paused at a stall overflowing with colorful heirloom tomatoes, discussing their merits with a cheerful vendor, a young woman with soil still under her fingernails. The murmur of happy conversations, the laughter of children, the strumming of a lone guitarist near the fountain. It was a perfect Saturday morning. The harmony was abruptly shattered by a sudden escalation of voices from a nearby stall. One, selling handcrafted leather goods. Althea looked over, concern furrowing her brow. A young black man, likely a college student judging by his backpack and attire, was in a heated but not physically aggressive dispute with the stall owner, a burly, red-faced man who seemed to be accusing the student of trying to shortchange him or steal a small item. The student was vehemently denying it, his voice rising in frustration, insisting on a misunderstanding. The vendor was getting louder, more accusatory, his face flushed with anger. Other shoppers were starting to stare, an uncomfortable tension rippling through the previously cheerful atmosphere. Althea felt the familiar internal tug of a situation, potentially requiring de-escalation, but she hesitated, hoping it would resolve itself. Then a uniformed police officer, who had been idly chatting with a coffee vendor nearby, began to amble over. This was Officer Dalton, a man whose reputation in certain community circles preceded him, known for his short fuse, his tendency to escalate situations rather than calm them, and a documented pattern of disproportionately aggressive interactions with minority citizens. Althea recognized him vaguely, from having seen his name on arrest reports that occasionally crossed the periphery of federal cases. Dalton arrived at the leather goods stall with a heavy-footed, authoritative presence, immediately siding with the visibly agitated white vendor, without bothering to gather facts from both sides. "What's the problem here?" Dalton barked, his gaze fixing dismissively on the young black student. "This kid trying to cause trouble?" The vendor, emboldened by the officer's immediate support, launched into a loud, exaggerated account, accusing the student of attempted theft and then becoming disrespectful when confronted. The student tried to interject, to explain his side, that he'd simply asked for change for a larger bill before deciding not to purchase, and the vendor had misunderstood, but Dalton cut him off sharply. "All right, son. I've heard enough." "From you," Dalton snapped, grabbing the student's arm roughly. "You're coming with me. We'll sort this out down at the precinct." "What? For what?" the student protested, alarm replacing his frustration. "I haven't done anything wrong. You haven't even heard my side." Dalton just tightened his grip, starting to pull the student away. Althea, witnessing the clear procedural violation, the lack of investigation, the immediate assumption of guilt, the unnecessary physical escalation, felt her judicial instincts, her deep-seated commitment to due process and fairness, override her desire for anonymity. This wasn't right. This was an abuse of authority unfolding in plain sight. She stepped forward calmly, her voice polite but firm. "Officer, excuse me," she began, intending to simply suggest he speak with both parties before making an arrest. But Dalton, already puffed up with his own authority and clearly annoyed by the student's protests, whirled around to face her, his expression hostile. He saw not a concerned citizen, but an interfering black woman, dressed casually, daring to question his actions. "Who the hell are you?" he sneered, his eyes raking over her dismissively. "This is official police business. Stay out of it unless you want to be arrested for obstruction." His voice was loud, aggressive, designed to intimidate, to silence. He had already made his judgment, not just about the student, but about her. Judge Althea Hayes stood her ground, unfazed by Officer Dalton's aggressive posture and dismissive tone. Years on the federal bench, presiding over complex, often contentious cases, had forged in her a core of unshakable composure and a deep understanding of the law and its abuses. She recognized Dalton's behavior immediately, the classic tactics of an officer relying on intimidation rather than procedure, likely fueled by bias and a fragile ego. She refused to be cowed. "Officer," she repeated, her voice remaining calm and measured, a stark contrast to his escalating hostility, "I am merely a concerned citizen who witnessed the initial interaction. It appeared to be a misunderstanding that could perhaps be resolved with a calm conversation with both parties involved, before resorting to an arrest." She deliberately used neutral, de-escalating language, hoping to appeal to some remnant of professionalism he might possess. She kept her hands visible, her posture open and non-threatening. She was not challenging his authority to make an arrest if probable cause existed. She was questioning his process, his immediate jump to coercion without proper investigation. Dalton, however, seemed to interpret her calm demeanor and articulate speech not as a reasonable attempt at mediation, but as a further challenge, an affront to his authority from someone he had already dismissed based on her race and gender. His face flushed an even deeper red. "A misunderstanding," he spat, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He released his grip on the student momentarily, taking a menacing step towards Althea, invading her personal space. "Lady, I'm a police officer. I think I know a troublemaker when I see one. And right now," his eyes narrowed, his gaze contemptuous, "you're starting to look like one too. You need to mind your own damn business and move along before you find yourself in the back of my car for interfering with an officer." The threat was explicit, an attempt to silence her through fear of arrest. The young student, momentarily forgotten, watched with wide, frightened eyes. Other shoppers, initially drawn by the argument, now began to back away, sensing the situation was becoming dangerous, unwilling to get caught in the crossfire. Althea did not move. She held his gaze, steadily. "Officer Dalton," she said, her voice still quiet but now carrying an unmistakable edge of steel, the voice she used in her courtroom when addressing disrespectful attorneys or recalcitrant witnesses. Your badge grants you authority, not the right to bypass due process or intimidate citizens who are lawfully present and expressing concern. Your current conduct is unprofessional and appears to be predicated on assumptions rather than facts." She subtly shifted her weight, a small, almost imperceptible squaring of her shoulders, a silent assertion of her own inherent dignity. She was not just some random lady, she was a United States federal judge, and though he didn't know it, he was currently behaving in a manner that could have severe legal and professional repercussions if properly documented. Her calm, precise, almost legalistic response seemed to infuriate Dalton even further. He clearly wasn't accustomed to being addressed this way, certainly not by a black woman in casual attire whom he had already relegated to the category of insignificant nuisance. He saw her quiet confidence not as strength but as insolence. His training, if he remembered any of it beyond the use of force, abandoned him completely. His face contorted in a snarl of raw anger. "Unprofessional assumptions," he roared, his voice drawing more alarmed stares. "I'll show you unprofessional." And then, with a sudden violent movement that shocked everyone, including Althea, he shoved her. Hard. With both hands flat against her chest, the force of the shove was unexpected, brutal. Althea, caught completely off guard, stumbled backwards, her feet tangling. She cried out a small involuntary sound of surprise and pain as she lost her balance and fell heavily to the hard cobblestone pavement of the farmer's market. Her straw hat flew off. The contents of her canvas tote bag, a half-dozen ripe peaches, a loaf of artisan bread, a small volume of poetry, spilled out, scattering around her like colourful, mocking confetti. Pain shot through her hip and wrist as she landed, the impact jarring her entire body. For a moment she lay there, stunned, breathless, the bright blue sky above her seeming to tilt and spin. The sounds of the market, the music, the chatter, seemed to recede, replaced by a roaring in her ears and the sharp, immediate throb of her injuries. Officer Dalton stood over her, his chest heaving, his face flushed with triumphant rage, looking down at her crumpled form with a look of undisguised contempt. "Maybe that'll teach you to stay out of police business, lady," he sneered, apparently satisfied with his assertion of dominance through physical violence. He had silenced her, put her in her place, just as he intended. He had no idea that in shoving Althea Hayes to the ground, he hadn't just assaulted a citizen. He had assaulted the very dignity of the federal judiciary, and the full weight of that transgression was about to come crashing down upon him. Lying on the rough cobblestones, a sharp pain radiating from her hip and wrist, Judge Althea Hayes fought back the initial wave of shock and dizzying disorientation. The blatant, unprovoked physicality of Officer Dalton's assault was stunning, even for someone who had witnessed countless accounts of police misconduct in her courtroom. To experience it firsthand in public, while simply attempting to advocate for procedural fairness, it was a visceral, sickening reminder of the raw abuse of power that far too many citizens endured. Her first instinct, purely human, was a surge of white-hot anger, a desire to lash out verbally, to scream at him. But years of judicial temperament, the ingrained habit of maintaining composure under extreme pressure, quickly asserted control. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. She wouldn't descend to his level. Slowly, wincing, as she put weight on her injured wrist, Althea pushed herself up into a sitting position. Her linen pants were stained with dirt, her blouse disheveled. The scattered peaches and her book of poetry lay around her like casualties of the encounter. Several onlookers gasped. A few rushed forward as if to help, but then hesitated, intimidated by Officer Dalton, who still stood nearby, glaring down at her, his expression a mixture of smug satisfaction and perhaps a dawning, faint unease as he registered the shocked reactions of the crowd. The young student he had been manhandling stood frozen, forgotten for the moment, his face a mask of fear and disbelief. Althea took a deep, steadying breath, ignoring the throbbing pain. She met Officer Dalton's contemptuous gaze, her own eyes, clear, cold, and utterly unwavering. The time for polite suggestions was over. The time for de-escalation had been violently terminated by his own actions. Now, it was time for accountability. "Officer Dalton," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, carrying clearly despite her position on the ground. It wasn't loud, but it held a resonant authority that seemed to cut through the surrounding noise, causing several more people to stop and turn. You have just committed assault and battery against a citizen. You have done so under color of law. You have violated my civil rights, and you have done so in front of numerous witnesses. She stated each fact precisely, like a prosecutor laying out the counts of an indictment. Dalton scoffed, though a flicker of uncertainty now touched his eyes. He hadn't expected her to speak with such composure, such formality from the ground. He likely expected tears, hysteria, perhaps pleas for him not to arrest her. "Assault," he sneered, trying to regain the offensive. "Lady, you were interfering with an arrest. I used necessary force to move you out of the way. You tripped. End of story." He was already constructing his false narrative, trying to reframe his aggression as a justified response. Althea slowly, carefully began to get to her feet, assisted by the young student who finally rushed forward, offering a hesitant hand. "Thank you, young man," she said to him quietly, before turning her full attention back to Dalton. She stood, brushing dirt from her pants, ignoring the pain, her dignity somehow amplified by the disarray. "Officer Dalton," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "there was no necessary force. There was an unprovoked assault, and I did not trip. You shoved me with intent, causing me to fall and sustain injury." She paused, letting her words sink in, watching his bravado begin to visibly erode under her direct, unflinching gaze and the weight of multiple witnesses now watching intently. "I suggest," she said, her voice dropping slightly but losing none of its power, "that you call your supervising officer to this scene immediately. And I also suggest you provide me with your full name and badge number, as you are required to do." This direct demand, this calm assertion of her rights and knowledge of procedure, seemed to genuinely rattle Dalton. He wasn't used to being challenged, so effectively, so articulately, especially by someone he had already dismissed. He hesitated, glancing around at the growing crowd, at the stern faces of some of the older vendors who clearly disapproved of his actions. "I don't have to give you anything," he blustered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You're the one causing a disturbance here. Am I, officer?" Althea arched an eyebrow. "Or are you attempting to deflect from your own egregious misconduct?" She took a deliberate step closer, not aggressively, but with an undeniable aura of authority that seemed to make him instinctively take a half-step back. "Perhaps," she said, her voice now like polished steel, "you are unaware of exactly who you just assaulted." She reached slowly into the inner pocket of the light jacket she wore over her blouse. Dalton tensed slightly, his hand moving towards his belt, his eyes suspicious. Was she reaching for a phone? A weapon? He clearly hadn't learned anything. Althea ignored his reaction. With a smooth, practiced movement, she withdrew a small, flat black leather case. It looked unassuming, perhaps a wallet or a card holder. She held it in her hand for a moment, meeting Dalton's confused and increasingly apprehensive gaze. Then, with a decisive flick of her wrist, she flipped it open. Inside, nestled against rich blue velvet, wasn't a driver's license or a credit card. It was a gleaming gold shield, intricately embossed with the scales of justice and the words, "United States Federal Judge." Beside it, clearly visible, was her official judicial identification card, bearing her photograph and her full title, "The Honorable Althea Hayes, United States District Court Judge." She held the open badge case steady, directly in Dalton's line of sight, letting the full weight of what he was seeing register. "Officer Dalton," she stated, her voice devoid of all previous politeness now resonating with the full, unimpeachable authority of her office. "You just assaulted a sitting United States federal judge. I suggest your next call be to your union, a representative and an excellent criminal defense attorney. You are going to need them." The color drained completely from Dalton's face. His jaw dropped. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as he stared at the gold shield, the official title, the woman he had just shoved to the ground, no longer an insignificant lady, but a figure of immense legal power. The misjudgment was catastrophic. The reckoning was about to begin. The sight of the gleaming gold FBI shield and the words, "United States Federal Judge," seemed to suck all the air out of the immediate vicinity. Officer Dalton stared, his face a mask of disbelief rapidly contorting into raw, unadulterated panic. His bravado, his aggression, his racist contempt, it all evaporated instantly, replaced by a stark, visceral terror. He looked from the badge in Althea's hand to her stern, uncompromising face, then back to the badge as if his mind couldn't fully process the catastrophic reality of his actions. He had physically assaulted a federal judge, in public, in front of witnesses, while on duty. The implications crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow, far more devastating than the shove he had delivered. His career, his pension, his freedom, all of it flashed before his eyes, suddenly in dire jeopardy. He opened his mouth, perhaps to stammer an apology, an excuse, anything, but no sound emerged. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or perhaps his own future unraveling. The crowd of onlookers who had been murmuring amongst themselves fell into a stunned, almost reverent silence as the words "federal judge" rippled outwards. They stared at Althea with newfound awe and respect, then turned their collective gaze, now laden with condemnation, onto the rapidly crumbling Officer Dalton. The young student, who had been nervously trying to gather Althea's scattered peaches, froze mid-stoop, his eyes wide with astonishment. Even the surly leather goods vendor looked shocked into silence. Althea Hayes maintained her composed, authoritative stance, holding the badge case steady, letting the full weight of her revealed identity sink in. She had deliberately chosen this moment, this public unveiling, to maximize its impact, to ensure Dalton couldn't try to twist the narrative or minimize his actions later. "Officer Dalton," she repeated, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Your name and badge number, please, and I am formally requesting your supervising officer be summoned to this location immediately." Dalton finally found his voice, though it was a strangled, barely audible croak. Dalton, badge 815. Yes, ma'am. Your Honor, I'll call my sergeant right away." He fumbled for his radio, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He keyed the mic, his voice trembling and several octaves higher than before. "Dispatch, this is 815, requesting a supervisor to my location, City Center Farmers Market, immediate. And notify IA, please." He didn't dare look at Althea as he spoke. The transformation from arrogant bully to terrified subordinate was absolute and instantaneous. While Dalton stammered into his radio, Althea calmly began gathering her belongings, accepting help from the now very solicitous student and several other onlookers who rushed forward, offering apologies for not intervening sooner, expressing their shock and outrage at Dalton's behavior. She thanked them graciously, her demeanor professional yet appreciative, subtly taking control of the narrative, ensuring witnesses felt comfortable and empowered to speak. She made mental notes of those who seemed particularly observant or willing to provide statements. Several people were already on their phones, likely calling news outlets or posting about the incredible scene unfolding. A federal judge assaulted by a local cop at the farmers' market. The story was already going viral even before official channels could react. Within minutes, which felt like an eternity to the sweating Officer Dalton, multiple patrol cars converged on the scene, lights flashing, not with the aggressive urgency of Dalton's earlier arrival, but with a more cautious, almost deferential approach. A stern-faced sergeant emerged first, his eyes immediately finding Althea, then Dalton. He was quickly followed by two plainclothes detectives, who Althea recognized as likely being from internal affairs, their arrival astonishingly swift, indicating the severity with which Dalton's radio call had been received. The sergeant approached. Althea respectfully. "Your Honor," he began, his voice grave, "I'm Sergeant Miller. I understand there's been a serious incident involving one of my officers." "There has, Sergeant," Althea replied calmly, handing him her judicial identification for verification, which he accepted with a nod. "Officer Dalton, badge 815, without provocation or cause, physically assaulted me, shoving me to the ground and causing injury, after I questioned his unprofessional handling of a minor dispute involving that young man." She gestured towards the student, who nodded his corroboration. Officer Dalton also displayed a frankly unacceptable level of hostility and bias. I have numerous witnesses. Sergeant Miller looked at Dalton, his expression one of deep disapproval and barely concealed fury. "Dalton," he barked, "secure your weapon and step over here. You are relieved of duty pending a full investigation. Do not speak to anyone further until you have consulted with your union representative." Dalton, looking utterly defeated, complied silently, his face ashen. He was quickly but formally disarmed by another officer and escorted to a waiting patrol car, effectively placed under watch by his own colleagues. The Internal Affairs detectives then approached Althea, introducing themselves respectfully, assuring her that a full and thorough investigation would commence immediately. They took her preliminary statement right there, amidst the now buzzing farmers' market, carefully documenting her account, collecting witness contact information, and photographing her visible injuries and the scene. The swiftness and seriousness of the response, now that her identity was known, was a stark, damning contrast to Dalton's earlier dismissive arrogance. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. The fallout was only just beginning. The Internal Affairs investigation into Officer Dalton's conduct proceeded with a speed and intensity rarely seen for complaints originating from ordinary citizens. The fact that the complainant was a sitting United States federal judge, alleging not just unprofessionalism, but a physical assault under color of law, catapulted the case to the highest priority within the police department and the city administration. The chief of police himself was briefed within the hour, as was the mayor's office and the city attorney. The potential for a massive scandal, a costly federal lawsuit, and irreparable damage to the department's already strained community relations was immense. There would be no slow-walking this investigation, no burying it in bureaucratic red tape. Detectives from the Professional Standards Bureau descended upon the farmers' market, meticulously interviewing every witness Althea and Sergeant Miller had identified. Their accounts overwhelmingly corroborated Judge Hayes' version of events. Dalton's initial aggressive handling of the student, his hostile and dismissive reaction to Althea's calm interjection, the unprovoked shove that sent her sprawling, and his subsequent sneering remarks. The vendor who had initially complained about the student, now realizing the gravity of the situation and perhaps fearing repercussions himself, suddenly remembered the interaction much more clearly, confirming Dalton's disproportionate response. Even Dalton's own partner, if he had one on scene or nearby, would have been under immense pressure to provide a truthful account, knowing a federal judge was the victim. Officer Dalton, after consulting with his visibly stressed union attorney, provided a statement that attempted to minimize his culpability. He claimed Judge Hayes had been verbally aggressive and interfering with a lawful arrest, forcing him to use minimal physical contact to create space and maintain officer safety. He denied intentionally shoving her or using excessive force, suggesting she had perhaps lost her balance. He tried to frame it as a misunderstanding in a chaotic situation, but his narrative crumbled under the weight of consistent witness testimony. And crucially, Althea Hayes' own highly credible, detailed account, delivered with the precision and authority of a seasoned jurist. Her status didn't just lend weight to her complaint. It meant her observations about due process violations, procedural irregularities, and Dalton's biased demeanor carried the expertise of someone who judged such matters for a living. The investigation quickly uncovered Dalton's service record, which, like Officer Kincaid's in a previous story, revealed a pattern. While he had no sustained complaints for physical assault resulting in serious injury, his file was littered with informal complaints and supervisory notes regarding a hot temper, unprofessional language, and a tendency to escalate minor situations, particularly during interactions with minority citizens. There were several instances where his use of force, while ultimately deemed within policy by previous, perhaps less scrutinized reviews, bordered on excessive. Viewed in isolation, these prior incidents might have been dismissed. Viewed in the context of assaulting a federal judge, they painted a damning picture of an officer with a long-standing problem with anger management, bias and abuse of authority, whom the system had failed to adequately address until he made a catastrophic, high-profile mistake. The city's legal department, anticipating the inevitable multi-million-dollar federal civil rights lawsuit, went into crisis mode. They advised the chief of police and the mayor that defending Dalton's actions was untenable. The evidence was overwhelming, the victim unimpeachable and possessing immense legal and moral authority. A public trial would be a disaster, further inflaming community tensions and likely resulting in a massive punitive judgment. Their recommendation was swift and unequivocal: pursue immediate, decisive disciplinary action against Dalton and attempt to negotiate a settlement with Judge Hayes to mitigate the damage. Within days, Officer Dalton was formally suspended without pay, pending termination proceedings. The chief of police issued a public apology to Judge Hayes and the community, condemning Dalton's actions as unacceptable and not representative of the department's values. A statement met with some skepticism by community activists familiar with the department's history. The mayor echoed these sentiments, promising a thorough review of departmental training and disciplinary procedures. The system, often criticized for its opacity and defensiveness in cases of officer misconduct, was reacting with uncharacteristic speed and force, largely because the victim wasn't just any citizen, but a powerful figure from another branch of government, capable of bringing immense external pressure to bear. Judge Hayes, while appreciating the swift internal response, knew this was only the first step. True accountability required more than just one officer's downfall. It required addressing the systemic issues that allowed officers like Dalton to operate with such impunity for so long. She consulted with her own legal counsel, trusted colleagues from her days in private practice, and began preparing her formal legal response, intending to use her unique position not just for personal redress, but as leverage for broader, lasting reforms. Judge Althea Hayes did not pursue her case against Officer Dalton and the city with an eye towards personal financial gain or vindictive retribution. Her motivations were far deeper, rooted in her lifelong commitment to justice, her profound understanding of the Constitution, and the painful first-hand experience of having her own rights and dignity violated by someone sworn to uphold those very principles. The physical injuries, the bruised hip, the sprained wrist, healed relatively quickly, but the psychological impact, the cold fury at the abuse of power she had witnessed and endured, fueled a determined resolve. She knew her position afforded her a unique platform, a rare opportunity to effect change that most citizens facing similar abuse could only dream of. She intended to use it to its fullest extent. Through her attorneys, she formally rejected the city's initial, quiet offers of a substantial monetary settlement conditioned on confidentiality and a waiver of further claims. Instead, she presented a clear, comprehensive set of demands that went far beyond personal compensation. Her primary focus was on systemic reform within the police department. She demanded not just Officer Dalton's termination, but a thorough review of his entire complaint history and an investigation into why his pattern of problematic behavior had not been addressed sooner by his supervisors. She insisted on mandatory enhanced de-escalation and implicit bias training for all officers, developed in consultation with community leaders and civil rights experts, with specific modules addressing respectful interaction with diverse populations, and the proper handling of citizen inquiries during police actions. She called for a strengthening of the Civilian Complaint Review Board, advocating for independent investigators and greater transparency in its findings and disciplinary recommendations. Furthermore, she demanded a public, unequivocal apology from the city and the police department, not just to her but to the community, acknowledging the harm caused by biased policing and committing to tangible, measurable improvements. Her demands were audacious, going far beyond what the city typically conceded in police misconduct cases. But Althea held all the cards. The city knew that a federal lawsuit filed by a sitting U.S. judge detailing a public assault by one of their officers would be a legal and public relations catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The prospect of Judge Hayes herself testifying, under oath about her experience, cross-examining police officials and potentially having other victims of Dalton's conduct come forward, was a nightmare scenario for the city's attorneys and political leadership. Her legal team skillfully leveraged this, making it clear that Judge Hayes was prepared to litigate vigorously and publicly if her demands for systemic reform were not met. The negotiations were intense, often fraught. Some city officials and police union representatives initially resisted, arguing the demands were too broad, too costly, an overreach based on a single incident, conveniently ignoring Dalton's prior record. But Althea and her team remained steadfast. They weren't just negotiating a settlement, they were fighting for principles. She personally reviewed every counteroffer, every proposed compromise, her judicial mind dissecting the legal language, her unwavering commitment to justice guiding her decisions. She refused to accept cosmetic changes or empty promises. She wanted binding commitments, measurable outcomes, real accountability. The turning point came when Althea, through her attorneys, signaled her willingness to participate in a carefully structured public mediation process, but only if the city agreed in principle to the core tenets of her reform demands. The prospect of having a federal judge publicly detail her assault and the systemic failures that enabled it, even in a mediated setting, was enough to break the remaining resistance. The city council, facing immense public pressure, fueled by continued media coverage and activism from community groups who had rallied behind Judge Hayes, authorized the city attorney to agree to the substantial reforms. The final settlement, when announced, was groundbreaking. It included Officer Dalton's permanent removal from the police force. He officially resigned to avoid certain termination, his career in ruins. It mandated a comprehensive overhaul of the department's training on bias, de-escalation, and community interaction, with progress to be monitored by an independent auditor. It allocated significant new funding and expanded powers to the Civilian Review Board. And it included a formal public apology from the mayor and the chief of police, read at a press conference, where Judge Hayes stood, silent but resolute, a powerful symbol of justice, achieved not through vengeance, but through principled, unwavering insistence on systemic accountability. The monetary portion of her personal settlement was substantial, but as she had pledged from the outset, Althea announced the entirety would be donated to establish a foundation dedicated to providing legal aid for victims of police misconduct and funding community-based violence prevention programs. Her stand had not just brought justice for herself, it had created a pathway for potential justice and reform for many others. The settlement agreement between Judge Althea Hayes and the city sent immediate and significant ripples throughout the local law enforcement landscape and beyond. It wasn't just the financial payout, which, true to her word, Althea immediately channeled into her newly established Foundation for Justice initiatives, or the forced resignation of Officer Dalton that made headlines. It was the comprehensive, mandated reforms to police training, oversight, and accountability that truly signaled a potential paradigm shift. Activists and civil rights organizations, often frustrated by the slow pace of change and the perceived intransigence of police departments, hailed the agreement as a landmark victory, a testament to what could be achieved when power, principle, and strategic legal action converged. They pointed to the specific, measurable commitments, the revised use of force policies emphasizing de-escalation, the revamped implicit bias training co-designed with community input, the strengthened Civilian Review Board with actual teeth, as a potential model for other cities grappling with similar issues. Within the police department itself, the reaction was more complex. There was undoubtedly resentment from some rank-and-file officers and union officials who felt Dalton had been made a scapegoat, that the reforms were an overreaction, and that the incident unfairly tarnished the reputation of the entire force. The blue wall of silence mentality, though shaken, hadn't crumbled entirely. However, there was also a significant, if quieter, contingent of officers, particularly younger ones, and those in leadership positions who genuinely desired reform, who saw the settlement as a necessary, albeit painful, catalyst for positive change. They recognized that Dalton's conduct was indefensible, and that restoring public trust required tangible steps towards greater accountability and professionalism. The mandatory retraining sessions, when implemented, were reportedly more rigorous and challenging than previous efforts, forcing officers to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and the impact of their actions on diverse communities. The fact that the reform stemmed directly from an incident involving a federal judge gave them an undeniable weight and seriousness that previous internally driven initiatives often lacked. The foundation Althea established, funded by her settlement, quickly became a vital resource in the city. It provided pro bono legal representation to individuals alleging police misconduct, particularly those from marginalized communities who lacked the resources to hire their own attorneys. It funded workshops on knowing your rights, de-escalation techniques for civilians encountering police, and bystander intervention training. It also supported grassroots organizations working on violence prevention and restorative justice programs. Althea, while maintaining her demanding schedule on the federal bench, took an active role as chairperson of the Foundation's board, guiding its mission, ensuring its resources were deployed effectively and occasionally, when her judicial duties permitted, speaking at community events, not about her own specific case in detail, but about the broader principles of justice, accountability, and the shared responsibility of citizens and law enforcement to build safer, more equitable communities. The case of the Judge and the Farmers Market Cop, as it became colloquially known, was studied in law schools and police academies as a case study in the intersection of civil rights, police misconduct, judicial authority, and the power of strategic litigation to drive systemic reform. It highlighted the critical importance of officer accountability, the devastating impact of unchecked bias, and the unique leverage that can be brought to bear when the victim of abuse is themselves a powerful figure within the justice system. While no one incident could magically solve the complex, deeply entrenched problems of racial bias and police misconduct, Althea's courageous stand, her refusal to quietly accept an apology or a private settlement, had undeniably moved the needle in her city. She had used her pain, her platform, and her profound understanding of the law not just to achieve personal vindication, but to try and make the system itself a little more just, a little more accountable for everyone. The ripples of her actions continued to spread, a testament to the enduring power of one individual's principled fight against injustice. Months after the settlement, as the initial storm of media attention subsided and the hard work of implementing the mandated reforms began, Judge Althea Hayes found herself often reflecting on the farmers' market incident, not with lingering anger, but with a kind of weary, profound understanding. She had presided over countless cases involving abuse of power, civil rights violations, and the devastating consequences of prejudice. She had listened to harrowing testimony, reviewed mountains of evidence, and handed down judgments intended to uphold the Constitution and provide a measure of justice. But experiencing that abuse firsthand, feeling the sting of unprovoked aggression, the humiliation of public degradation, the casual dismissal based solely on her appearance, it had provided an education no law book or courtroom proceeding ever could. It had stripped away the judicial detachment, however briefly, and connected her viscerally to the lived experiences of the countless individuals whose cases came before her, particularly those from marginalized communities who routinely faced such injustices without the inherent power or platform she possessed. She didn't regret her decision to step forward that day to challenge Officer Dalton's misconduct, despite the personal cost and the unwelcome public attention. She knew with absolute certainty that her actions had been necessary not just for herself, but for the young student Dalton had been manhandling, and for the broader principle of accountability. She also knew that her identity as a federal judge had been the decisive factor in the swiftness and severity of the outcome. It was a sobering thought. What if she had been just Olivia, the concerned resident, without the hidden power of her office? Would her complaint have been taken seriously? Would Dalton have faced any real consequences? The likely answer, she knew, was a resounding no. Her experience became a stark reminder of the immense power imbalances that still defined so many interactions between citizens and law enforcement, and the critical need for mechanisms to protect those without built-in authority. This understanding fueled her work with the foundation she established. She ensured its resources were directed towards empowering ordinary citizens, providing them with the legal tools and advocacy support they needed to challenge injustice. She often met with the young lawyers and paralegals working for the foundation, sharing insights, offering guidance, emphasizing the importance of meticulous preparation, unwavering resolve, and deep empathy for their clients. She saw in their youthful idealism and dedication a reflection of her own early career, before the weight of the bench had settled upon her shoulders. On the bench itself, the incident subtly informed her perspective, while her commitment to impartiality and rigorous application of the law remained absolute. She found herself perhaps even more attuned to the nuances of power dynamics in the cases before her, more skeptical of official narratives that seemed to dismiss or downplay the experiences of ordinary citizens, particularly when allegations of bias were involved. She became an even stronger advocate for procedural fairness, ensuring that every voice was heard, every piece of evidence thoroughly examined, every right scrupulously protected. She didn't let her personal experience cloud her judgment, but it undoubtedly deepened her empathy and sharpened her focus on the lived realities behind the legal arguments. She rarely spoke publicly about the specifics of her own assault, preferring to let the settlement and the ongoing reforms speak for themselves. But in quiet moments, perhaps walking through a different farmer's market in a different city, she would sometimes feel a faint echo of the pain in her hip, a ghost of the humiliation. It served not as a source of bitterness, but as a constant, visceral reminder of why she did what she did, why she had dedicated her life to the often frustrating, always challenging, but profoundly necessary pursuit of justice. Officer Dalton had intended to diminish her, to silence her, to assert his dominance. Instead, he had inadvertently reawakened a deeper layer of her judicial resolve, reminding her that the fight for justice wasn't just an abstract legal principle, it was a deeply personal, ongoing commitment, demanding courage and vigilance, both on and off the bench. Years passed. Officer Dalton faded into disgraced obscurity, his name a footnote in police misconduct records, a cautionary tale whispered among rookies. The city, while still grappling with the complexities of police-community relations, saw, tangible if incremental, improvement stemming from the Farmers' Market Accord. As the settlement and its associated reforms came to be known, the enhanced bias training, initially met with resistance, gradually began to show positive effects in complaint statistics and community feedback. The strengthened Civilian Review Board, armed with greater independence and resources, handled cases with increased transparency and rigor, leading to more consistent and credible disciplinary outcomes. Body cam activation became nearly universal, and the footage itself was more frequently used, not just for prosecution, but for training and identifying areas for procedural improvement. The changes weren't perfect, the system still flawed, but the trajectory had shifted, nudged forward by the focused pressure Judge Hayes had applied. The Althea Hayes Foundation for Justice and Community Empowerment flourished. It became a respected and influential organization, not just locally but nationally, known for its effective legal advocacy, its innovative community programs, and its unwavering commitment to empowering marginalized voices. It funded critical research on bias in the justice system, supported bail reform initiatives, and provided scholarships for aspiring civil rights attorneys from underserved backgrounds. Judge Hayes, while her judicial duties remained her primary focus, continued to provide strategic guidance to the foundation, ensuring it stayed true to its core mission. She often said that the foundation was her way of paying forward the privilege of her position, of ensuring that the power she wielded could benefit those who possessed none. The young student from the farmer's market, whose name was Michael, graduated from college and, inspired in part by Judge Hayes's intervention and subsequent work, decided to go to law school. He often volunteered with the Hayes Foundation, sharing his own story and crediting the judge with not only protecting him that day, but also igniting his passion for social justice. He represented the kind of ripple effect Althea hoped to create, one individual empowered, who then went on to empower others. Judge Hayes herself continued to serve with distinction on the federal bench. Her reputation for fairness, intellectual rigor, and profound empathy only grew. Lawyers appearing before her knew they would get a fair hearing, but they also knew she had little tolerance for abuses of power or attempts to subvert due process. Her personal experience at the farmers' market was never explicitly mentioned in her courtroom, but those who knew her story often felt its unspoken presence in her unwavering commitment to upholding the rights of all citizens, particularly the most vulnerable. She became a sought-after mentor for young judges and attorneys, especially women and people of color, navigating the often challenging terrain of the legal profession. Occasionally, when attending community events or even just walking through a different farmer's market on a quiet Saturday morning, someone would recognize her, not just as Judge Hayes from the news, but as the woman from that incident. They would approach her, sometimes tentatively, to thank her for her courage, for standing up, for making a difference. She always accepted their gratitude with grace, but gently steered the conversation away from herself and towards the ongoing work, the collective effort still needed to build a more just society. She knew her story had become a symbol, but she was determined that it be a symbol not just of one individual's dramatic confrontation, but of the enduring power of principled resistance, the importance of systemic accountability, and the quiet, relentless pursuit of justice that defined her life, both on and off the bench. The legacy of that Saturday morning wasn't just about Officer Dalton's downfall. It was about the enduring changes, the empowered voices, and the renewed hope that emerged from the scattered peaches and the undeniable authority of a federal judge who refused to let her dignity be trampled. She walked into the market as a citizen, seeking simple pleasures. Officer Dalton saw only a target for his prejudice, an opportunity to assert dominance. He shoved her, mocked her, never imagining the quiet woman in casual clothes held the full weight of the federal judiciary in her spirit and eventually in her hand. He tried to diminish her dignity, unaware he was assaulting the very symbol of the law he was sworn to uphold. For those of us who have ever felt invisible, disrespected, or abused by those in authority, who know the sting of being judged by appearance, rather than character, this story is a powerful affirmation. We understand the courage it takes to stand up, especially when you are physically assaulted and publicly humiliated. Maybe you've been in a situation where your voice was dismissed. Maybe you've felt the crushing weight of injustice and wondered if anyone would believe you, if anything could change. But Judge Althea Hayes' story is a thunderous reminder that true authority isn't derived from a uniform or a weapon, but from integrity, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. She didn't just win a legal battle. She transformed a moment of personal violation into a catalyst for systemic reform. She showed that resilience isn't just about enduring, it's about fighting back with wisdom and strategy, using the tools of the system to hold the system itself accountable. Her power wasn't just in her title, it was in her refusal to be silenced, her determination to ensure that what happened to her would serve a greater purpose. So if this story moved you, if it inspired you with its portrayal of quiet strength, turning the tables on blatant abuse, if it reminded you that one person, armed with principle and position, can indeed make a profound difference, please share this message. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to see that justice can prevail, that dignity is non-negotiable, and that even the highest seats of power can be wielded for the good of all. Until next time, stand firm in your convictions, demand accountability, and never underestimate the power of a righteous stand.